So as a big Bob Dylan fan and someone who has quite literally seen Dylan in concert twice in the past 3 to 4 years, I was very excited for A Complete Unknown. Like a lot of people in their 20s, I discovered Dylan. I discovered him in college for myself, and like he became a big thing and he became instantly a part of the music canon. And the aura and the mystery around Dylan and the whole idea of who Dylan is as a person and as an artist has fascinated people for generations, so much so that it's inspired other filmmakers. And I wanted to read this quote from director Todd Haynes, who directed the movie I'm Not There, which explores Dylan's life, 6 chapters through 6 different actors portraying a character that is supposed to resemble Dylan. And I wanted to read this quote from him because I think this idea of him being the most enigmatic man of the 20th century is a big idea and something that influences A Complete Unknown. And Haynes writes, the moment you try to grab hold of Dylan, he's no longer where he was. Dylan's life of change and constant disappearances and constant transformations makes you yearn to hold on to him. And I think this is the correct approach for Bob Dylan for the way Todd Haynes is doing it. And I think what makes James Mangold's version of A Complete Unknown exciting is he's not exactly trying to do that. And when I hear this quote from Bob Dylan, I think that that is a good way to explain the myth of Dylan as an artist and as a person. And I also have always just kind of been bugged by this idea of not being able to capture and understand who Dylan is as a person. I think there is a really simplified way to look into Dylan, and that way is he is a talented artist that comes at the expense of him having a essentially normal life. And that's, I think, what this movie is trying to describe in A Complete Unknown. And that's what James Mangold is trying to do as an artist, is explain like, hey, he is an artist and the person behind the art doesn't matter as much. And I think that is where I found a lot of success within A Complete Unknown. Ultimately, A Complete Unknown is Dylan is who Dylan is. He is a talented lyricist, always pushing himself to experience and chase a new challenge. And James Mangold essentially is exploring that idea of Dylan and what happens when you are the age of 21 and you climb the mountain and you make it, you peak. You become about as famous as anyone can be. You really revolutionize music. You've made your imprint at the young age. And now what? Now what are you left doing? And for Dylan, he doesn't try to climb the mountain again. He's not doing all of that. He kind of asked the question of, well, what if I just snowboarded down the mountain this time? Like he's always trying to reinvent and challenge himself. And I think that's what I appreciated a lot with A Complete Unknown, is somebody who is never satisfied with themselves and always trying to work on something new and trying to accomplish something new. And in the chase for new, he has to leave everything and anyone behind at a moment's notice when he starts feeling this discontent. This movie is a chase movie, and the chase is Bob Dylan. You are always trying to catch up and keep up with Dylan as he is going through different elements of his mind. And just by the way, if you're liking this review, make sure to like and subscribe for more. It allows me to see these movies early for review. Back to my actual review of it. A Complete Unknown isn't trying to explain who Bob Dylan is, because honestly, and I think Mangold does this really well, and especially Chalamet, who we'll get to in a second, who cares who Bob Dylan is? Rather, it explores experiencing Dylan for the first time. You remember this idea that I had earlier of learning about Bob Dylan in my early 20s in college. That's what this movie is. It's these really talented artists, whether it's Joan Baez, whether it's Pete Seeger, whether it's Woody Guthrie, whether it's Johnny Cash, all meeting the person that is Bob Dylan and having the experience that I now have 50 plus years later. And that's the power of this movie, is 1961 and 2020, our relationship with Dylan is the same time the first time we hear it. And that's what this movie is, chasing that experience, what it's like. For me, like I said, this movie mirrors my own experience discovering him and, you know, in my own head, building and mystifying and elevating him into the music canon in real time as I'm discovering it. And I think that's how a lot of people feel about Bob Dylan, the artist. A Complete Unknown is interested in capturing the essence of Bob Dylan and how that he can represent anything and everything to any person all at once. He is a for a lack of better word, as the title implies, he is a complete unknown. He is a blank slate, and that's what allows him to move through genres of music. That's what allows him to move through his life. And it's also what allows him to kind of have the tumultuous lifestyle that he had in the 1960s. Who he is doesn't matter. And James Mangold understands that in A Complete Unknown. What he is and what he represents as an artist is what is going to be defined as Bob Dylan in years forward. And I think that gives this film a bit of a timeless feeling of it's not really trying to encapture Bob Dylan in a single moment of time. It is exploring Bob Dylan as we will always kind of remember him. And what he is, truthfully, is he's the greatest artist of the 20th century who achieves greatness at the expense of his own kindness. And that's what I believe James Mangold and Timothée Chalamet are exploring in A Complete Unknown. One of my favorite aspects going into this movie, and I think it's the struggle that other musical biopics can have, is a lot of times these films try to valorize their portrayal of the person at the center of the screen. Chalamet and Mangold are not interested in that approach for A Complete Unknown. They paint Dylan as an asshole with commitment issues. He is somebody who has commitment issues, yet hates to be alone. As I described it earlier, this movie is a chase movie, and it's about a man who is always on the move, which is actually fascinating, and I think it's what makes James Mangold a good director for this movie, is James Mangold is very well versed in action and movement. I think of a film like Logan, or I think of his recent Indiana Jones movie, with those are action set pieces. That is essentially a similar framework for A Complete Unknown, because this movie is always capturing someone kind of on the run, and on the run from themselves, on the run for quite literally a minute ago. They don't want to be where they were a minute ago. And that's the fascinating thing with Dylan in this and Mangold's approach to it. To be stationary would kill Bob Dylan. He hates being told what to do. It's that rebellious spirit within him. And it's especially very clear when he enters the folk scene in the 1960s with the backdrop of civil rights conversations going on in America at this time. And this is a clever way of which this movie uses the period of 1961 to 1965. It does cut to moments of history, which is so famous now, whether it's Kennedy's assassination, whether it's MLK's I Have a Dream speech, whether it's the death of Malcolm X, like all these individual moments. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a big one in this movie. Like, it really captures the time, the spirit of the 1960s, and what Bob Dylan can then represent for a generation discovering him for the first time. And we need to get to the elephant of the room, which is Chalamet. Timothée Chalamet's performance as Bob Dylan, A Complete Unknown. And I had some reservations going into it. Now, I have to just kind of admit now at this point, me betting against Timothée Chalamet is probably one of the stupidest things I can do as a film critic. Every time I seemingly bet against him, he excels. I didn't know if he could do Wonka. He did Wonka. I didn't know if he'd be a good Paul Atreides. He's a great Paul Atreides. You look time and time again at his career, and you're just like, oh yeah, this guy consistently makes the best choices as an artist. And that's what he does with Bob Dylan. I think this performance from Chalamet is nothing short of spectacular. He is unlikable. He is a narcissist. He is self-serving. But what I found so enlightening about Chalamet's approach is he's not letting that define Dylan. None of those bad characteristics that I'm placing on Dylan, I don't believe Chalamet uses them as an indictment on Dylan. And he does approach it of, he may be unkind, but he also wrote Blowing in the Wind. That is who he is. Like, he is the guy that wrote Blowing in the Wind. And I think that's a pretty special thing that Chalamet is able to balance, of being respectful, capturing the complexities of a human being, and also just saying like, hey, this guy is an artist, and let's kind of remember that first and foremost. And I am a vessel to explore what this artist means to a generation and generations to come. Not me as an actor trying to be self-serving and explain how in 1961 Bob Dylan came to be. Who cares about the origin story? Bob Dylan says it at one point in this movie, like, everything we talk about of our past is a lie. We just cherry pick what we want to say. And I think Chalamet does a great job with that, along with the impression of it. Because let's be honest, we all can do a Bob Dylan impression. So let me try mine. How does it feel to be on your own? No direction home. A complete unknown. Like a rolling stone. See, I have a Dylan impression. It's not very good. It's nowhere near as good as Chalamet's impression, but we all have an idea of how Bob Dylan sounds because it's maybe one of the most iconic voices. And I know that's the sometimes trigger with people with Bob Dylan is they just cannot get over the voice. And let me tell you, seeing him in concert the past 5 years, the voice hasn't aged well, but it is such a defining trait of Dylan. And I think Chalamet does it pretty exceptionally without ever being a full-blown impression. It feels like he is able to interpret an idea of Dylan and a characteristic of Dylan without just becoming the caricature of him. And I think at the beginning of the movie, you can definitely feel it and you're like, oh, he is going to go for a 1-to-1 ratio of impression and just kind of do karaoke of Dylan. That's not what he does. He does branch out as the movie goes along. And I think Chalamet gets better. And I think when Dylan becomes more, if you want to say, lost as a character, and it becomes far more focused on the legacy / who Bob Dylan is as an artist, I think that's when Chalamet is able to really climb and elevate himself as a performer. I've said it right now. I haven't seen Adrian Brody yet in The Brutalist, so maybe that will change my opinion. Right now, I think Chalamet should win the Oscar. I think the performance is that good, and if a guy like Rami Malek can win it for a pretty bad Freddie Mercury movie, I think Chalamet should win it for a pretty good Bob Dylan movie. And the genius of Chalamet's performance is he doesn't try to answer who Bob Dylan is. Rather, he recognizes the artist's art and is a vessel to communicate that to the audience. He is purposefully distant in his portrayal of Dylan. There is no real come to Jesus moment in this movie, and it's smartly written to be that way in this movie. There's no big monologues. There's no real, this is everything about me explained in 30 seconds, beautifully executed. Like, that's not in this movie. In fact, this movie doesn't have much spoken dialogue. It's far more in a concert film in how it goes. I think there's like 30 to 40 songs performed in this movie. And that's, it's putting the focus on the music and the art, not the artist. And I think it's a pretty dynamic way to do it. His performance is, I think it's this big idea of it. And let me read how I wrote it. His performance must have been similar to meeting Dylan during this time frame and post leaving asking the question, what is this guy's deal? That's every time with this movie. That's how I left thinking about Dylan. And especially when I'm done with the movie or in certain scenes during the movie, I'm just like, what is he? Like, what is his problem in this moment? And it doesn't need to be answered. It doesn't need to be answered because we don't know exactly what his problem is, but we know whatever it was caused him to go electric. It caused him to write Highway 61 Revisited. It caused him to write Blonde on Blonde. It then later on in the 1970s causes him to turn to Christianity and start making Christian music. And it's left to everyone else to try and cast and determine who Dylan is as a person. And that's the performances that we see from Monica Barbera's Joan Baez. That is Edward Norton as Pete Seeger. This is Elle Fanning as Sylvie, who in real life is the character of Susie, who was Bob Dylan's then girlfriend. And this is all these characters struggling to determine who Bob Dylan is. And then you have other artists in this movie, someone like Boyd Holbrook, who plays Johnny Cash, or someone like Scoot McNairy as Woody Guthrie, who just instantly understand who Bob Dylan is, encourage the talent, and also recognize, hey, he's going to do what Bob Dylan's going to do, and we just want to be here to experience the greatness of Dylan. So it's this nice juxtaposition between these characters, and the performances are all really standout. Monica Barbera, who some of you may know from Top Gun Maverick fame, she is wonderful as Baez in this movie. It is a great just musical performance from her. She's really able to just elevate this role and this relationship, this tumultuous relationship that she has with Dylan, along with the character of Sylvie, this love triangle that they're all caught in, and no one can really personify or explain who Bob Dylan is or what Bob Dylan wants, but they know that Bob Dylan seemingly needs them, but also seemingly doesn't care about them. It's this complex relationship that we explore with Monica Barbero, Elle Fanning, and Timothee Chalamet. And some of the criticism of this movie will just be, well, a lot of this movie is just Joanne and Sylvie just looking up in amazement of Bob Dylan. And that's a lot of the movie. Like Edward Norton spends time doing it. Boyd Holbrook does it as Johnny Cash. Like it's a lot of this movie is the audience experiencing Dylan for the first time. And some people are going to find that repetitive. And it certainly can have its repetitive beats. I noted that in my review as well. There are approaches to the filmmaking here, and especially this decision, that can make the film feel a bit repetitive, especially when we know the end result. When the movie is about the idea and is based on the book, Dylan Goes Electric, we know he goes electric. Like, it's not a surprise. It's not a shock to anyone. And so it does have a repetitive nature with the way that these characters treat and look at Bob Dylan. Now, I have heard the criticisms that some will critique and say that this movie doesn't examine Dylan. I would counter that and say this movie examines Dylan by unexamining the artist and letting him speak for himself. Sometimes the lack of examination is an examination in itself, and that's how I felt with moments like this in the movie, but it's certainly noticeable. And at 2.5, maybe it's actually like 2 hours and 15 minutes, it certainly can feel a little draining at times where you're just like, okay, like I get it. Like, can we kind of go on to the next scene? I certainly felt that. And I don't always think James Mangold's direction is up to par with it. I think there is a craftsmanship to James Mangold that allows the movie to feel of its time in 1960 and in how movies look in 2020s Hollywood. I also think there is a lack of artistry vision from him sometimes. And that's not to say that James Mangold is a poor artist. I think he's a very talented director. I just don't think he has quite the artistic flair on screen. He's a very stripped down workhorse director. And I appreciate that of him. To do that in a Bob Dylan movie at times feels antithetical because Bob Dylan is anything but traditional, where I think Mangold kind of can excel in traditionality. With that all said, there's so much to like about it. And I mean, like I said, with this whole idea of this movie largely being a concert film, we have 20 to 30 minutes of the movie that actually has dialogue, and the rest is just incredible music from 1961 to 1965. And yes, there is a lot of joy to be found in him playing Highway 61 Revisited for the first time, when he finally figures out the noise, the sound to go electric, and we see him in the recording studio. Like, as a huge fan of Highway 61, as someone who considers that one of their favorite albums of all time, like, yeah, I had a lot of fun with that. And I know some people are going to think like, well, isn't that just the beats of a music biopic? Like, what makes this better / different from Bohemian Rhapsody or Rocket Man or any of these other musical biopics? What makes this different from Mangold's last musical biopic in Walk the Line? And I believe the difference is those films are highly conscientious of the artists and are concerned about them, where this film is concerned about the art. And that's what makes The Complete Unknown and Bob Dylan essentially just being a vessel for this music. That's why I really appreciated this approach that the film made. And ultimately, I found it compelling. I liked all the elements of this movie. I liked the Chalamet performance. There's just a lot to recommend. And Chalamet, again, just one last thing of praise for him. He apparently learned how to play guitar and sing for this movie. Like, he spent like the past 4 years doing it. I just think it's a pretty compelling movie. It's one that I had a lot of enjoyment of. And as someone who is quite fascinated with this time period, knew this story broadly, but didn't know all the details to it, I thought A Complete Unknown did justice to the Bob Dylan legacy / artist and art that I had to appreciate it, and I'm giving it a pretty positive review. I'm going 3.5 stars out of 5. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more. I'll be back in theory Friday for Nosferatu, which I just saw. Saturday, I'll be here for Night Bitch. Sunday, I'll be here for Baby Girl. And then Monday, worst of 2024. Tuesday, best of 2024. And then starting the new year, I got some most anticipated movies of 2025. I have a review of Wallace and Gromit. So this is the time. Thank you all so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe and help get me to my goal for 2025 is to double it. So essentially I want to get to somewhere around 3,000 subscribers. So that's a huge goal for me. So make sure to subscribe and help me out if you like this video. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll meet you down on Highway 61.